My brother and I woke up early one morning, around 3 a.m. We left the campsite in the dead of night, watched the sun rise over El Paso, and drove out of the city. We left so early because we wanted to make it to our next stop, Big Bend National Park, with enough time to cross the border into Mexico and explore the town of Boquillas del Carmen on the other side of the Rio Grande and make it back to the U.S. before the border crossing closed. After nearly 6 hours of driving through one of the emptiest parts of the country, across a time zone and through the occasional small desert town, we were not only in the same state, but in the same region, the mountainous desert arm that is West Texas, a region that might seem relative to the rest of the state to be fairly small, but is roughly the size of South Carolina. The next day, another 7 hours to San Antonio, and still we were far, far away from the other side of the state. It's hard to really grasp the true size of Texas until you take a trip across this massive section of the United States, one that makes up a 12th of the entire lower 48 states. From the deserts and peaks of the Mountain West, to the high prairies of the Great Plains and the canyons that pierce them, to the valleys and plateaus of the hill country, the swamps, forests, and bayous of the east, and the beaches and sandy barrier islands on the Gulf, to the millions of people inhabiting some of the largest cities in the country, sprawling metropolises that make Texas a true population giant, this state cannot easily be pinned down. Where the American South meets the American West, this is a land of cattle ranchers, cowboys, and oilmen, of Cajuns, of border towns where Spanish has been spoken long before this place was ever called Texas, of wide-open starlit skies and of skyscraper-studded cities where people have come from across the country and the world seeking the opportunity that it promises. An independent country that chose to join the United States, Texans retain their strong sense of identity and pride that has made their state and its distinct regional culture iconic across the globe. This is that story. I'm in Houston, Texas's largest urban area and the 5th largest in the entire United States. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. This is the U.S. Explained, episode 29, Texas. Thanks NOLA Mattress for sponsoring. Head to nolamattress.com/thatisinteresting and use my code THATISINTERESTING to get $50 off your NOLA mattress plus 2 free pillows with select mattresses. I visited Texas as part of a 6-month-long filmmaking trip, traveling all across the country to make episodes for the U.S. Explained. Spending so much time on the road, one thing that I really grew to appreciate was getting a good night's sleep. I know I always feel more awake, more productive, and just ready for the day when I've slept well the night before. And key to a good night's sleep is a comfortable mattress to sleep on. I'm sitting on my new NOLA mattress. NOLA is an award-winning mattress and sleep accessory brand specializing in premium mattresses that offer exceptional pressure relief, cooling, and durability, and it's conveniently shipped to your door for free. I just got this mattress and I'm already loving it. I like to sleep on my side and personally wanted a mattress that was easy to set up, could keep me cool at night, was comfortable but firm, and could help me sleep better. Based on this, I got the NOLA Evolution mattress in twin size and luxury firmness. I love just how comfortable this mattress is and how easy it was to get. Instead of having to go to a store, I just placed the order and NOLA delivered it right to my door. The setup was honestly super easy. Instead of having to fit a big mattress through doorways and carry it around corners, it comes rolled up in a box and it inflates when you take it out of the packaging. All NOLA mattresses are made to order at their facility in Arizona. They do their own coiling, foam pouring, foam cutting, lamination, and sewing in-house, ensuring quality at every step. All of NOLA's mattresses are also created without the use of harmful chemicals, so you can sleep safely and soundly knowing there will be no off-gassing. Unlike other brands, NOLA mattresses also do not contain fiberglass, which can be detrimental to your health. As I mentioned before, the best part about this is that NOLA delivers your mattresses right to your door, with free shipping in the US. If it makes you nervous to buy something that you haven't tried, NOLA has a 120-night sleep trial, so you get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. Plus, NOLA mattresses have a limited lifetime warranty, and they even offer financing options and flexible payment plans. I love my NOLA mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking to upgrade your sleep, head to nolamattress.com/thatisinteresting and use code THATISINTERESTING to get $50 off your NOLA mattress plus 2 free pillows with select mattresses. This is higher than what's being offered on site, so check them out while you can. According to the Köppen climate classification, Texas sits within 8 different climate zones. Most of the state, predominantly in the east and central of Texas, is part of the humid subtropical climate zone that's common across the south, with hot summers, mild winters, and high humidity. Beyond it, we move into climate zones that we haven't encountered yet in this series. The plateaus of the Northwest, including much of the Texas Panhandle, are part of the cold, semi-arid or steppe climate, with cold, dry winters and hot, dry summers. Much of the Rio Grande Valley is part of the warmer, hot, semi-arid zone, with warm winters, hot summers, and little rainfall. Finally, West Texas is a mix of cold, semi-arid zones, as well as hot deserts and cold deserts, both of which have hot summers and extremely little rainfall, the only difference being colder winters in the latter. In the desert, climates often vary from valley to mountain, and short distances can make all the difference. Individual peaks in West Texas include hot and warm summer Mediterranean as well as oceanic climate zones. Texas ranks on the lower side at 40th when it comes to relative humidity. If you're from Texas and are scratching your head thinking of summers in Houston, the measurement of dew point, which measures how sticky the air actually feels, places Texas at the 6th most humid state in the country, after just Hawaii and the other Gulf Coast states. Far to the south, it's the 5th hottest state in the country, with an average temperature of 65.97 degrees Fahrenheit or 18.87 Celsius. The very south is typically the hottest part of the state, the lower Rio Grande Valley, clocking some of the hottest temperatures in the country, while it gets cooler the further north you go. It's the 4th sunniest state in the country. Only the fellow desert states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada are sunnier. It's more in the middle in terms of rainfall. It's 35 inches of rain, making it 33rd in precipitation, but there are huge differences depending on where you are in the state. The swamps and forests of East Texas are incredibly rainy, while the Chihuahuan Desert in the west is very dry. It's the 7th least snowy state, usually getting on average just 1.36 inches of snowfall a year, typically just in the Panhandle. However, it can absolutely get snow. A 2021 winter storm infamously caused much of the state's power grid to fail, causing millions of people to lose power for days, crippling the state's infrastructure and services, and leading to hundreds of deaths. And in early 2025, snow even fell in coastal areas like Houston. Droughts and wildfires are problems particularly in the west, while Tornado Alley stretches down into North Texas. Finally, flooding and hurricanes are major natural disasters that strike the state as well, especially on the low-lying Gulf Coast. 2017's Hurricane Harvey caused $125 billion in damage to Houston, tying it with Hurricane Katrina as the country's costliest natural disaster, while in 1900 the Galveston hurricane took as many as 12,000 lives in the coastal city, making it the deadliest natural disaster to ever strike the United States. The state sits in 2 time zones. Most of Texas is located in Central Time, while the very western tip of the state, including El Paso, which as well as sitting far closer to Albuquerque or Las Cruces than to any other major Texas city, forms with neighboring Ciudad Juarez, the country's 2nd busiest border crossing, and like its 2 neighbors, is located in Mountain Time. West Texas makes the state the first we've covered so far in the U.S. Explained to be located in Mountain Time, as well as the westernmost state by far, the first on the Mexican border, and the first to include a desert. Another exciting note, with this episode we are officially more than halfway done with the U.S. Explained. The name of the state likely comes from the Caddo, an indigenous people native to East Texas. Their word for friend, taisha, was used by Spanish colonists to refer to them, though in the Hispanicized term teja. The Spanish referred to the colony as La Provincia de los Tejas, literally just meaning the land of the Caddo, though under Mexico the los would be dropped. An alternate spelling, pronounced the same though using an X instead of a J, was also popular, and American settlers who moved in used the anglicized pronunciation of Texas that we use, though Tejas, spelled with a J, is still considered a proper term for the state in official Spanish. Texas is famously nicknamed the Lone Star State, a name that comes from its flag but also encapsulates its independent spirit. Its Lone Star flag is easily one of the most iconic American state flags, and along with Hawaii's flag, one of just two that represented an independent nation. It depicts a white and red bar, as well as a blue stripe with a white star on it. The same colors of the American flag, they represent loyalty, purity, and bravery. Many Texan independence leaders had been Americans who'd crossed the border and settled in the Mexican state, and it's likely that the flag was heavily inspired by the American flag itself. Additionally, it's thought to have taken inspiration from the flag of a short-lived revolt calling itself Fredonia against the Mexican government in the city of Nacogdoches, while the Lone Star itself comes from the flag of the Republic of West Florida, a short-lived republic in what is today Louisiana, founded by Americans who broke away from Spain before their small country was annexed by the United States. Texas, in my opinion, has one of the best state flags in the country, and it's one that Texans take a lot of pride in. You see Lone Star flags flying everywhere in the state, and on Texas clothes and merchandise. This is probably the state with the most state pride, and you'll see some truly enormous Texan and American flags there, and huge flags are definitely a thing. Texans seem to take the popular catchphrase, "everything's bigger in Texas," as a challenge, from the mega churches to the massive gas station and travel center Buc-ee's, or the ridiculously large supermarket H-E-B. Another well-known saying, "don't mess with Texas," started as an anti-littering campaign, but caught on as a statement of Texan swagger. The state's main license plate is a fairly basic black and white design, reading the Lone Star State with a star and an outline of Texas. As part of my US Explained tour, I spent a week and a half in the state, coming in from New Mexico and visiting El Paso and Big Bend National Park, before driving across the state and visiting its other major cities, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth. Obviously, Texas is a huge state and there's a ton to see, so I wasn't able to visit it all, but I appreciated getting to spend time in a number of different cities and regions across the state. Many, though not all, of the photos and footage included in this video were taken by me on this trip, including the thumbnail. If you have a guess as to where the thumbnail was taken, go let me know in the comments. Texas is, simply put, a behemoth, both in land area and population, taking up 268,596 square miles, or 695,662 square kilometers. It's the second largest state in the country and the largest in the lower 48, second to only the enormous state of Alaska. Just for fun, were you to add 100,000 square miles to the state of California, about the equivalent of Oregon's land area, Texas would still be larger, and California's third by size, the runner-up to Texas. In fact, other than Alaska, California, and Montana, which along with Texas are the four largest states in the country, none of the country's 46 other states, including huge states like New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, are more than half the size of the Lone Star State. There are only 38 countries larger than Texas. It's bigger than France, Ukraine, and Madagascar. The country's smallest state, Rhode Island, could fit into Texas 173 times over. In fact, you could fit 14 different states together comfortably within the Lone Star State. It stretches at its greatest length more than 800 miles north to south and 773 miles east to west. That means there are parts of Texas that are closer to Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and Santa Barbara, California, closer to Fargo, North Dakota, and San Ignacio, Belize, than to other parts of Texas. In fact, the closest beach to El Paso isn't South Padre. It's the Gulf of California in Mexico. Actually, even the beaches of San Diego, 3 huge states away, are closer to El Paso than the Gulf Coast beaches of Texas, its own state. Were you to overlay Texas on the eastern seaboard, you could fit New York City, Chicago, Toronto, and Durham, North Carolina, all within the same state. It's second in terms of population as well, home to a whopping 30.5 million people, 9% of all Americans, and more than any other state in the country besides California. More people live in Texas, for example, than all of Australia, and it surpasses the third place state, Florida, by nearly 8 million. Combine the population of the country's 18 least populous states, and Texas still has more people. No less than 5 major urban areas, including the country's 5th and 6th largest population centers, are located in Texas, alongside dozens of mid-sized and smaller cities throughout the state and countless small towns. The second largest state by both area and population, it's unsurprisingly squarely in the middle in terms of population density, with 117 people per square mile, or 43 per square kilometer, 23rd out of the 50 states, and not far from the lower 48's average of 113 per square mile. Texas is located pretty much squarely in the south-central part of the United States. There's a famous festival every year in Austin called South by Southwest, and that's a pretty good way to describe the state, as something of a blend of the South and the Southwest, along with a healthy bit of the Great Plains. It's so large that it stretches across several major American regions, and sometimes people making regional maps of the country will just describe Texas as its own region altogether, which is kind of fair considering the state has a pretty strong cultural identity. It borders 4 U.S. states, 4 Mexican states, and the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf sits to its southeast, Louisiana to its east, Arkansas to its northeast, Oklahoma to its north, New Mexico to its northwest, and the Mexican states of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas to its southwest. Texas's 4 neighboring Mexican states are more international states or provinces than any other U.S. state borders, and its 1,241-mile-long border with Mexico is not only the second longest international border in a single U.S. state after Alaska's Canadian border, but it makes up nearly 2/3 of the entire U.S.-Mexico border altogether. The border with Louisiana follows the Sabine River upstream from the Gulf of Mexico, the cities of Port Arthur and Orange sitting across the border from Louisiana. At a spot near the town of Joaquin, it leaves the river and follows a straight path north for 71 miles, or 114 kilometers, before changing to a border with Arkansas and continuing north for another 36 miles, or 59 kilometers, until it reaches the Red River. On the way, it passes through the city of Texarkana. I won't go into too much detail on Texarkana because I talked about it more in my Arkansas video, but it's a city literally split down the middle between 2 different states, the border running right through the center of town, and even splitting individual buildings like the courthouse, post office, train, and police station between Texas and Arkansas. Arkansas briefly lies across the Red River until the northern border changes to one with Oklahoma. Oklahoma lies across the Red River and its prairie dog town fork until a spot near the town of Childress, where it leaves the river and heads in a straight line north, with Oklahoma lying to its east. It continues for 134 miles, or 215 kilometers, before turning west near the town of Follett for 116 miles, or 268 kilometers, Oklahoma's Panhandle sitting to its north. New Mexico sits to the north for just 2 miles before the border turns south, forming the Texas Panhandle. New Mexico sits to Texas's west for 310 miles, or 500 kilometers, then to its north for another 208 miles, or 335 kilometers, as the border turns west before reaching the Rio Grande at the town of Anthony, which is divided right in two between Texas and New Mexico. Here the border rarely actually follows the river, weaving instead through suburban neighborhoods of El Paso, as it maps the course the river followed when the border was laid out. This is less of a problem downstream, as the US and Mexico have swapped small parcels of land to reflect the actual path of the river. New Mexico suburbs like Sunland Park and Santa Teresa sit across the state line from El Paso. Beyond Sunland Park, it's Mexico itself, not New Mexico, that lies across the Rio Grande. Downtown El Paso sits directly across from the larger Ciudad Juarez, Mexico's 9th largest urban area. Together, the 4 bridges connecting the 2 cities, with some 18 million crossings annually, form the second busiest border crossing into the United States, after the San Isidro crossing in San Diego, and the cities, collectively home to 2.3 million people, are surpassed by only San Diego and Tijuana as the second largest cross-border metro area between the U.S. and Mexico. Juarez is part of the state of Chihuahua, which sits across the Rio Grande until near where the river turns at Texas's Big Bend National Park, where it becomes a border with Coahuila. As the river makes a wide bend once more, heading back towards the southeast, it passes through two important border crossings, Del Rio across from the Coahuila town of Ciudad Acuña, and Eagle Pass across from Piedras Negras. Downstream from Coahuila, it has a tiny 9-mile border with the state of Nuevo León before becoming a border with Tamaulipas. The Texas city of Laredo sits directly across from Nuevo Laredo, while further downstream, a string of cities like McAllen, Edinburgh, Harlingen, and Brownsville, part of a region collectively known as the Lower Rio Grande Valley, sit across from cities like Reynosa, across from Hidalgo and close to McAllen, and Matamoros, across from Brownsville. The small town of South Point is the southernmost part of the lower 48, besides South Florida, and the border ends not far from Brownsville, at the Rio Grande's mouth near Boca Chica Village, the headquarters of SpaceX and a major rocket launch site. As the border with Mexico and the longest river in the state, the Rio Grande is arguably Texas's most important river. It begins in the high peaks of Colorado's San Juan Mountains, flows into its San Luis Valley, and flows south into New Mexico, where its fertile valley is home to 2/3 of the state's entire population, before entering Texas just north of El Paso. A major tributary, the Pecos, flows in from West Texas from New Mexico. By the time the river enters the mountains and canyons of Big Bend country, so much has been used by upstream farms in New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico, and by riverside cities like El Paso, Juarez, and Albuquerque, that 3/4 of the water flowing through the Rio Grande comes from a far smaller Mexican tributary called the Rio Conchos. In the north, the Red River, drained by a number of streams in the Panhandle, carves out the spectacular Palo Duro Canyon before forming the Texas-Oklahoma border and eventually feeding the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers in Louisiana. Further north, the Canadian River also cuts across the Panhandle before eventually feeding into the Mississippi via the Arkansas River. Besides those, most of the state's major rivers feed into the Gulf of Mexico, flowing southeast out of the higher, drier plains of West Texas and the Panhandle. From east to west, they include the Sabine, Neches, Trinity, Brazos, Colorado, not the one that flows through the Grand Canyon. This is a different river, sometimes called the Colorado River of Texas, Guadalupe, San Antonio, and Nueces. Many of these rank among the longest rivers in the United States. The Colorado is 11th, for example. The Canadian, Brazos, and Pecos are 13th, 14th, and 16th. The Red is 8th, and the Rio Grande is surpassed by only the Missouri, Mississippi, and Yukon as the country's 4th longest river. But only the Red River ranks among the largest by amount of water discharged. Though the rivers of Texas span great distances, often originating in dry plateaus and watering vast amounts of farmland and huge populations, they often contain less water than may be expected considering their length. Most major lakes in the state, like the Toledo Bend and Sam Rayburn reservoirs, are artificially dammed, man-made lakes. Natural lakes in the state are typically pretty small. The Lone Star State's massive population is not evenly distributed at all. Most of its residents are generally clustered in the eastern half of the state, a lower-lying region that receives more rainfall and thus was easier to farm and settle. You'll sometimes hear of a Texas Triangle as an urbanized cluster stretching from Dallas-Fort Worth through Austin to San Antonio and Houston that's home to 70% of the entire state's population. While this conveniently includes Texas's 4 largest urban areas and follows the major highways that connect them, it's not really the whole story. Smaller cities like Corpus Christi, Beaumont, and Tyler sit outside of the so-called Texas Triangle, but if looking at a population map of the state, are still part of a region that is far more populous than the western half of Texas. Perhaps most importantly, the rural counties in Texas's east have typically far more people than those of the state's west. Texas has 254 counties, more than any state in the country, and it includes not only Harris County, America's third most populous, home to Houston and 4.7 million people, more than half the states in the country, but Loving County, the country's least populous, a West Texas county home to just 64 people. Some of these West Texas counties are very remote, and much of the land is desert, mountains, privately owned grazing or ranch land, or used for oil drilling, while further east, rural entails small towns, yes, but ones that are only a short drive from one another. If we look at a population map of the whole country, you can see that this pattern exists beyond Texas into Oklahoma, Kansas, and further north. Texas is where the more densely populated eastern half of the United States meets the more sparsely populated west, and this population cutoff is the result of the Great Plains. High plains and prairies rise up beyond Fort Worth, Waco, Austin, and San Antonio, including the Edwards Plateau, better known as the Texas Hill Country, and the Llano Estacado, Spanish for the Staked Plain, in the Panhandle. A fault line called the Balcones Escarpment separates the drier, rockier hill country and Great Plains from the lower-lying and more fertile coastal plain of the Gulf of Mexico. Major cities like Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio, and smaller cities like Waco, Temple, New Braunfels, and Del Rio sit on the Balcones Escarpment at the base of the hill country and the Great Plains. The Great Plains of Texas are one of the most populous parts of the Great Plains overall, thanks to the oil industry's growth of smaller cities like Lubbock, Amarillo, Abilene, Midland, and Odessa, but compared to the rest of the state, its population is far smaller. Further west, you reach the lower reaches of the Rocky Mountains and the Chihuahuan Desert, which, save for El Paso, is one of the most sparsely populated places in the United States. It's no secret that Texas has seen some pretty significant population growth in the past few years, but if you look at where that growth is actually happening, it's mostly been in the eastern half of the state, particularly in the suburbs of Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. Only one western county has experienced significant growth since 2020, Hudspeth County, a rural county just outside of El Paso. Small towns in West Texas and the Panhandle, for the most part, are shedding population pretty rapidly, a few counties even having lost up to 20% of their already small populations since the pandemic. In a state as large as Texas, there are a number of regions that are quite distinct from one another, typically centering on one of the state's major cities and often overlapping. In the very east, along the borders with Louisiana and Arkansas, is East Texas. This is a part of the state very culturally distinct from the rest. It is squarely part of the South, even sometimes considered an extension of the Deep South, settled primarily by Southerners who crossed the border into Mexico. It became the western edge of American slavery, and today is the center of the state's black population. When people say that Texas is part of the South, this is the part of Texas they're talking about. It's hot and humid, home to swamps and wetlands. Texas, surprisingly, is the third largest alligator population in the U.S. after Louisiana and Florida, and they mostly live in the east. It's a part of the state almost entirely covered in forest, like a lot of the South, while the rest of Texas is pretty treeless. Called the piney woods or the big thicket, the edge of the woodlands are sometimes called the pine curtain, culturally dividing East Texas from the rest of the state. It's home to a number of smaller cities like Tyler, Longview, and Nacogdoches. Closer to the Gulf Coast, a cluster of cities like Beaumont, Orange, and Port Arthur are culturally pretty similar to neighboring Louisiana. Coastal rivers, swamps, and bays along this part of the Gulf, like in Louisiana, are called bayous. Louisiana's Cajun country is right next door, and a number of Cajuns have followed the oil jobs across the border into East Texas, creating a Cajun corridor stretching along the Gulf into Houston. Additionally, a large community of people from New Orleans relocated to Houston after Hurricane Katrina, deepening the region's ties with its eastern neighbor. The region's urban core is Houston, an enormous, sprawling city on the Gulf Coast's Galveston Bay. It's the diverse cultural heart of East Texas, a major American financial center, the largest city on the Gulf Coast of not just the United States, but any country on the Gulf of Mexico, and the busiest port city in the United States. The Texas Gulf Coast, stretching all the way into South Texas to the Mexican border, is home to 3 of the country's 10 busiest ports. Houston is number 1, Corpus Christi number 3, and Beaumont number 8. each mostly driven by exports of oil from the state's interior. In fact, the three largest oil refineries in the United States, in Texas City, Port Arthur, and Beaumont, are each located in East Texas, each producing more than 600,000 barrels of oil every day.
Now, Texas might not be the first place that comes to mind when you think of coastal states, but on top of deserts, mountains, hills, plains, forests, and swamps, Texas has an enormous coastline, much of it protected by a string of barrier islands along the Gulf of Mexico. I'm on one of those islands right now, Galveston Island, home to the city of Galveston, which is an important port city and historic town, which has become a major tourist destination. Right behind me is the Galveston Pleasure Pier, which draws in tons of visitors to this beach destination.
With 5.85 million people in it and its suburbs, Houston is the largest urban area in Texas and the fifth largest in the entire United States, slightly ahead of Dallas-Fort Worth and surpassed by only New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami. Before you finish typing that comment about how my city or metro population numbers are wrong, go look up what an urban area is, or even better, watch my video on why I prefer it as a population measurement. It's not only Texas's largest urban area, but either the largest or second largest in the South, depending on whether or not you consider Miami to be southern.
Houston is the largest city in Texas and one of the largest in the entire United States. It's a center of the American oil industry, aerospace industry, and a major port city on the Gulf of Mexico.
South of the Oklahoma border is North Texas. The region is fairly flat and rural parts of it are mostly agricultural. It revolves around the Dallas-Fort Worth urban area, sometimes called DFW or the Metroplex, whose 5.73 million residents living in the two core cities, the larger Dallas and smaller Fort Worth, as well as major suburbs like Plano, Arlington, and Irving, place it just slightly behind Houston as the state's second largest urban area, and number 6 nationally, ahead of other huge cities like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Boston, and the San Francisco Bay Area. After Chicago, it's the second largest inland city in the United States and the largest that isn't located on a navigable waterway. The Trinity River, which flows through both cities, is pretty small at that point. A huge city with wide, sprawling suburbs, most of North Texas isn't located too far from the outskirts of the Metroplex.
Texas's second largest urban area, Dallas, together with neighboring Fort Worth, is the 6th largest in the entire country. It's a major business hub and the population center of North Texas, along with being the second largest inland urban area in the entire country, and the only one not located on a navigable river. Along with Houston, the DFW area helps make Texas the American center of population that it is today, the country's second most populous state, home to well over 20 million people. Half of DFW is Fort Worth. Now, this was an important frontier cow town. It became a center of the meatpacking and railroad industry, and today is the second hub of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, collectively the 6th largest urban area in the United States and the second largest in the state.
To its south is the region known as Central Texas. Between Dallas and Houston, the city of College Station, with 206,000 people in its urban area, is a college town home to Texas A&M University, whose 77,000 students make it the largest university in the United States, while a string of cities sit at the base of the higher Great Plains in a line southwest from Dallas. Waco, a small city on the Brazos River, is a railroad town that was the birthplace of Dr. Pepper and home to Baylor University. Beyond it, Temple and Killeen, with 114,000 and 257,000 people in their respective urban areas, sit not far from one another, their suburbs nearly overlapping. Temple is a historic railroad town, while Killeen revolves around the military. It's home to Fort Cavazos, until recently known as Fort Hood, a massive military complex in central Texas, built during World War II to train tanks. That's the 3rd largest military base in the United States by population, with some 217,000 people serving on base. South of Killeen on the Colorado River sits Austin, Texas's capital city, and its 4th largest urban area. The urban heart of central Texas, its 1.8 million residents, make it the 29th largest urban area in the U.S., slightly larger than Pittsburgh and slightly smaller than San Juan, Puerto Rico. The Austin metro area is the fastest growing metro in the entire United States, increasing its population by nearly 26% between 2010 and 2020, an enormous increase. Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth are all among the top 10 fastest growing metros as well.
Right now I'm in Austin. Texas's capital city is the fourth of its 5 major urban areas, and it's a booming, fast-growing metropolis in the center of the state. You can see cranes everywhere behind me. New buildings are rising all the time, and this city is one of the fastest growing in the country as young people are pouring in everywhere, especially in the years since COVID, particularly for jobs in the tech industry.
Further southwest, between it and San Antonio, suburbs are expanding into smaller cities like Kyle, San Marcos, and New Braunfels, which are beginning to form a near continuous string of development connecting Austin and San Antonio. Northwest of the two cities, rocky hills rise up, separating the coastal plain from the higher Edwards Plateau. This section of the plateau is known as the Texas Hill Country, and beyond the state's major cities is really the beginning of the American Southwest. This is a rural region home to beautiful springs and cave systems, but so close to the cities, suburbs of Austin and San Antonio are spreading further into it. This is Texas's wine country, and ranches and small towns dot the rocky green hills. A large number of Germans settled in the region and founded towns like Fredericksburg, generally a less common immigrant group in the South and Southwest, while the flatter parts of central Texas east of the hill country were a destination for Czech immigrants. Beyond Austin is South Texas, a region occupying the state's triangular southern tip between the Gulf of Mexico and the Rio Grande. One of the southernmost parts of the mainland U.S., the entire region sits further south than parts of Mexico, and its population is majority Latino, not just recent immigrants, but members of Mexican-American families that have lived in Texas for generations, as well as Tejanos, descendants of Spanish colonial settlers, and Mexicans who lived there when the state was part of Mexico. Though they claimed a far larger area, most Spanish and Mexican settlement was concentrated in what is today South Texas, particularly the capital city of San Antonio and cities on the Rio Grande like Laredo. After Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth, San Antonio is the third largest urban area in the state, home to 1.99 million people in it and its suburbs, which makes it the 24th largest urban area in the country, with fewer people than Portland and more than Sacramento, and it's the primary urban core of South Texas.
I'm here in San Antonio, the third largest urban area in Texas, home to around 2 million people. It's one of a number of major cities that gives this state such an enormous population. San Antonio is a beautiful and historic city. Its Riverwalk and the historic Alamo have made it a very popular tourist destination, and its skyline, which is on the smaller side, is home to a number of beautiful old brick buildings. San Antonio was in a large part the population center of Spanish and Mexican Texas. It's arguably the most historic of the state's 5 major urban areas.
Outside of the city, much of rural South Texas is prairie and scrubland. Closer to the Gulf Coast are large towns like Victoria, while the Gulf city of Corpus Christi, sitting in the large Corpus Christi Bay, is a major oil refining town in Port City. After the ports of Houston and South Louisiana, it's the third busiest port in the United States. The urban area itself is the 7th largest in Texas, with 339,000 people living in Corpus Christi and its suburbs. Huge barrier islands separate the inland bays and channels of South Texas from the open Gulf of Mexico. One of them, Padre Island, is a protected national seashore that stretches down much of the South Texas coast. After only Long Island, it's the second largest island in the states of the lower 48. Nearby South Padre Island is a popular beachside vacation destination for people from across Texas, and sits just north of the Mexican border at the mouth of the Rio Grande. Near the mouth of the river is a built-up agricultural region filled with smaller cities known as the Lower Rio Grande Valley, or just the RGV. Some 1.3 million people live on the American side of the RGV. Towns like McAllen, Edinburgh, Mission, and Hidalgo, right across the border from the Tamaulipas city of Reynosa, are together home to 779,000 people, making them the 6th largest urban area in the state, while at the very southern tip of the state, just upstream from the river's mouth, Brownsville, home to 216,000 people in it and its suburbs, sits right across from the Mexican city of Matamoros. Hidalgo and Brownsville are the country's 5th and 7th busiest border crossings, respectively. Most of the major border towns in Texas sit beside other cities on the Mexican side and are major points of crossing, trade, and ports of entry between the two countries. Further upstream, Laredo is a historic Spanish colonial city that sits across from its Mexican counterpart, Nuevo Laredo, which was founded after the Mexican-American War divided the city in two, and it's the 3rd busiest border crossing in the United States, after just San Ysidro in San Diego and El Paso. Outside of Puerto Rico, Laredo has the 2nd highest proportion of Latino Americans of any city in the U.S. after just East LA. More than 95% of Laredo's residents are Latino, mostly Mexican American. In fact, 5 of the 7 most Hispanic cities in the United States are Texan border cities: Laredo, Brownsville, Edinburgh, McAllen, and El Paso, and San Antonio and El Paso are the 2 largest majority Latino cities in the U.S., and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas is the largest swath of the country where a language other than English, in this case Spanish, is spoken by a majority of residents. Further north, the towns of Eagle Pass and Del Rio are both major points of entry as well, across the Rio Grande from the Coahuila cities of Piedras Negras and Ciudad Acuña, respectively. Throughout the Rio Grande Valley in particular, communities called colonias, typically small, majority Hispanic border towns and neighborhoods, are some of the most impoverished places in the United States. Some 40% of people living in Texas's colonias live in poverty, far higher than the national average. Houses there are typically built by residents as insufficient affordable housing was available, and basic services like water, electricity, sewage, and healthy food are often substandard. Far from all Texans in the Rio Grande Valley live in colonias, but they are a type of American town unique to the border region. Aside from the Rio Grande Valley, San Antonio and Corpus Christi, most of rural South Texas is pretty sparsely populated. Beyond Del Rio in the hill country, the land gets higher in elevation and drier, and we enter a region of desolate scrublands and arid plateaus. While in the eastern and central regions of the state, rural areas like many agricultural parts of the eastern U.S. are more heavily populated with small towns never too far from one another. West Texas, on the edge of the American Southwest, gets far more remote. Here, the southern end of the Great Plains tapers off into dry, rocky hills, while in the far west, the Chihuahuan Desert makes the state's Big Bend country one of the most sparsely populated parts of the lower 48. The United States produces more oil than any other country in the world, and some 42% of all U.S. oil comes from Texas, making it by far the country's largest oil-producing state. In fact, on a given day, the Lone Star State is responsible for nearly 7% of all oil produced on the planet, 5.6 million barrels a day. The country's most productive oil field is by far the Permian Basin, which lies beneath much of West Texas. It and the Eagle Ford Shale, which stretches across the state in a thin line from Dallas to San Antonio, are together responsible for most Texan oil production. West Texas is oil country. Oil wells are everywhere throughout the dusty prairies, and many of the smaller cities that have developed there revolve around the oil industry. The nearby twins of Midland and Odessa, separated by just 19 miles, are in the center of the Permian Basin. The small West Texas cities, home to 141,000 and 151,000 people in their respective urban areas. They are sometimes dubbed the Petroplex, a play on the DFW Metroplex. Another large town, Big Spring, sits to the east of Midland. On the edge of West Texas, where the region gets closer to Central Texas, sits the town of San Angelo. Further north, near the edge of West and North Texas, is the small city of Abilene, and just south of the Red River and the border with Oklahoma, Wichita Falls. In the prairie north of Midland, the city of Lubbock, with 272,000 people in it and its suburbs, is the 8th largest urban area in the state. Boosted by the oil industry, the plains of West Texas are one of the most populous parts of the American Great Plains. But besides the few small cities that dot the region, small towns in West Texas are generally few and far between. The counties of the region are among the least populous in the country, and much of the land is occupied by oil fields, large private ranches, salt pans, and scrublands, and the cotton farms fed by the Ogallala Aquifer, the huge underground water supply stretching south down the Great Plains from Nebraska. Texas is by far the country's largest cotton producer. A quarter of all cotton in the U.S. comes from the state, and much of it is from West Texas. Beyond Midland and Odessa rises the Chihuahuan Desert, which the state shares with New Mexico, Mexico, and Arizona. This part of the state is very much a part of the Southwest, home to beautiful canyon landscapes like Big Bend's Santa Elena Canyon and the peaks of the Chisos, Davis, Guadalupe, and Franklin Mountains. The deserts, basins, and mountain ranges of the American West are generally among the most remote parts of the country, but the deserts of West Texas feel especially secluded. In fact, Big Bend National Park, a spectacular national park in the Chisos Mountains along the Rio Grande, is so far from any major city that it's considered to have the darkest night skies of any place in the lower 48.
Texas is a huge state. On one end, you have swamps, bayous, and barrier islands. And here in West Texas, you have deserts, mountains, canyons, and cliffs, like the beautiful Santa Elena Canyon right behind me here at Big Bend National Park. This canyon is split between Texas and Mexico, with the Rio Grande carving out its gorgeous and majestic cliffs.
Texas's other national park, Guadalupe Mountains, is located in West Texas as well, surrounding a beautiful mountain range just south of the New Mexico border that contains Guadalupe Peak, the state's highest point. Both of these parks in a remote section of the state, but Guadalupe Mountains in particular, are among the least visited national parks in the country. Outside of the El Paso urban area, there are only 3 Texan towns west of the Pecos River with more than 5,000 people. This changes, of course, as we reach the very western tip of the state, home to the last of Texas's 5 main urban areas, El Paso. Home to 854,000 people in it and its American suburbs, El Paso is Texas's 5th largest urban area after Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. 53rd in the country, smaller than Tucson, but larger than Honolulu, and the 4th largest in the American Southwest after Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Tucson. The largest American city on the Rio Grande and the largest in West Texas, its suburbs stretch across state lines into neighboring New Mexico. Downtown El Paso sits just north of the Rio Grande, and the downtown of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico's 9th largest urban area and the largest city in the northern state of Chihuahua, sits just across the border. Together home to 2.5 million people, more than the entire urban areas of San Antonio or Austin, they make up the 4th largest cross-border metro area in North America, surpassed by only Detroit-Windsor, San Diego-Tijuana, and Vancouver and its neighboring towns in Washington. The city contains the 2nd busiest border crossing in the United States, second to only the San Isidro crossing between San Diego and Tijuana, with 18 million crossings recorded annually between the two cities. Another crossing in the southeastern neighborhood of Isleta is the country's 10th busiest border crossing.
I'm standing at the southern edge of the Franklin Range of the Rocky Mountains in El Paso, Texas, at the very western tip of the state. There are parts of Texas that are closer to Chicago than this city, just showing the incredible scope and scale of this state. This is one of the continent's largest cross-border cities. That mountain behind me is part of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, one of the country's largest cities, part of the state of Chihuahua. El Paso is a true southwestern city. It's the only major city in the state located in the desert. In the east, the state of Texas stretches as far as the swamps in the Louisiana border. El Paso is Texas's 5th largest urban area and a truly beautiful and interesting desert city.
Finally, north of Lubbock, nestled between Oklahoma, New Mexico, and the Red River, sits the very northern tip of the state, the Texas Panhandle. Geographically very similar to neighboring parts of the West Texas Great Plains and western Oklahoma, this is a region of dry prairies and rangelands. It's part of Tornado Alley, a large stretch of the Great Plains where tornadoes are pretty common, and is mostly agricultural. Oil and natural gas are major industries. Corn, wheat, and cotton are grown using water from the Ogallala Aquifer, and it is the center of the country's beef industry. There are over 12 million head of cattle in Texas, more by far than any other state, and twice as many as the state with the second most, Nebraska, and many are raised in the Panhandle, along with in eastern and central Texas. Nearly half of the region's residents live in and around a single city, Amarillo, home to around 205,000 residents in its urban area. An astonishing 30% of all beef in the United States is raised in the Texas Panhandle, and much of it is processed in Amarillo. The high plains of the Llano Estacado, the section of the Great Plains much of the Panhandle is located in, drop off to lower elevations in stunning gorges like Palo Duro Canyon, a beautiful, often overlooked canyon near Amarillo, formed by tributaries of the Red River, that, after only the Grand Canyon, is the second largest canyon by area in the United States. The land that is now Texas was originally home to a number of different indigenous peoples, descendants of people who had crossed into Alaska from Siberia, and from there settled the Western Hemisphere. In the deserts of West Texas lived the Apache, a powerful people who controlled a large swath of the Southwest, stretching into Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Mexico, and Colorado, a land the Spanish called Apacheria. In what is now South Texas and a large part of Mexico across the Rio Grande lived the Coahuiltecan people. The Humano lived in much of the state, stretching from the Big Bend region across the hill country and plains to what is now Dallas and San Antonio. Along the Gulf Coast from around Galveston Bay into Louisiana lived the Atacapa Ixoc. In East Texas, stretching into neighboring states, the Caddo were a confederation of numerous tribes who spoke a common Caddo language and shared descent from the Mississippian mound-building people of the region. The Karankawa lived along the Gulf Coast, all the way from what is now the Louisiana border to Corpus Christi Bay, and the Tonkawa lived further inland to the north. The Kiowa lived in the Panhandle, as well as in a stretch of the Great Plains that is now part of numerous different states. A group of Apache known as the Kiowa Apache lived along and allied with them. Further east in North Texas were the Wichita, while the Numana or Comanche dominated the southern Great Plains all the way from where Austin is today through the Panhandle to northern Kansas. Living in such an enormous land, there was incredible diversity between the native people of Texas, and many tribes spoke languages that were very different from one another. The Caddo and Wichita both spoke Caddoan languages, for example, while the Comanche and Kiowa spoke Udo-Aztecan languages, a language family that includes native languages from across the American West as well as Mexico, and includes Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztec Empire and Mexico's most widely spoken indigenous language. The language of the Apache, meanwhile, is part of the Na-Dene family, which includes not only the nearby Navajo, but languages spoken by native people as far away as Alaska and northern Canada. Some were nomadic, while in the east, descendants of the mound-building Mississippians like the Caddo settled in permanent towns and villages and farmed crops. Post-colonial Texas was part of a number of different countries and empires, 6 main ones, which, believe it or not, inspired the name of the Six Flags amusement park chain, a shortened version of their first park's name, Six Flags Over Texas. The first of the flags is that of Imperial Spain. Early Spanish colonialism centered on the islands of the Caribbean, which they called the West Indies, thinking them to be just west of the islands that now make up Indonesia and its neighboring island nations. The Spanish soon became aware that they were not, in fact, in Asia and had landed in a new continent altogether, but still believed that there could be a water passage west of the islands to Asia. In 1520, a Spanish explorer named Alonso Alvarez de Pineda left the island colony of Santiago, today known as Jamaica, to search for such a route. He found instead that Spain's colonies were not in a sea passage, but rather an enclosed gulf, and that a land, which he called Amichel, stretched north of Mexico all the way to what they thought had been the island of Florida. He became the first European to sight and map the land that would later become known as Texas. In 1527, Spain's King Charles I designated a man named Panfilo de Narvaez governor of this northern land, instructing him to begin establishing colonial settlements in the region. But Narvaez and his expedition of 600 men, leaving Santo Domingo for Florida, disappeared and wouldn't be heard from again for another 9 years, when a group of Spanish slave catchers encountered 3 Spaniards, including a man named Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and one North African man named Estevanico, living among native people in Sinaloa. After a disastrous expedition up the Gulf Coast, the expedition had shipwrecked near where Galveston is today, and many of their survivors died from disease, hunger, or were enslaved by the region's native people. Cabeza de Vaca and the 3 others were the only survivors, and had lived for 4 years among the native people of South Texas, documenting their culture and society, before making their way through the Rio Grande Valley and beyond into perhaps New Mexico and even Arizona, before heading south through Mexico. Though Spanish explorers would continue to visit it, Spain had no major presence in the region, claiming it but establishing no colonial settlements nor actual control, though they brought to the continent diseases like smallpox, which, along with violence and warfare with settlers, would decimate North America's indigenous people, killing 90% of them. That brings us to our second flag, France, who in 1682 explored the Mississippi River and claimed its entire watershed as the colony of Louisiana. René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, the French explorer who'd explored the Mississippi, led an expedition to found a colony at the river's mouth. He couldn't find it, though, and landed instead at Matagorda Bay on the Texas Gulf Coast, where he built a settlement called Fort St. Louis in 1685. The colony lasted only a few years. Looking for the Mississippi, La Salle was murdered by his own men in a mutiny near what's now the East Texas town of Huntsville. While the colony was destroyed due to disease, lack of supplies, and conflict with native people. Worried about this French colony and land they claimed as theirs, Spain sent expeditions north to search for Fort St. Louis, eventually discovering its ruins, but in order to prevent further French encroachment, decided to begin colonization of the region, declaring it a province, which they called the Land of the Caddo, in Spanish, La Provincia de los Tejas, and founding a mission among the Caddo, San Francisco de los Tejas. Though the initial mission would fail, other settlements and missions in East Texas, hoping to convert the native people of Tejas to Catholicism, would follow. Far to the west, Spain had established settlements in the upper valley of the Rio Grande, in what they called the province of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, and fleeing a conflict there with Spanish settlers called the Pueblo Revolt, a group of Puebloan people fled south down the valley, where they founded a pueblo called Isleta del Sur, the only pueblo in the state. It's located within El Paso today. The Spanish colonial government, hoping for a stopping point to connect the missions in eastern Tejas to the colonial towns in Nuevo Mexico, founded a new mission partway in between, called Mission San Antonio de Valero, and a town around it, San Antonio de Bejar. For the cottonwood trees that surround it, Alamos in Spanish, the mission became nicknamed the Alamo. San Antonio became the main Spanish city in the province, and eventually its capital city, populated by settlers from the Canary Islands. The province, which was at times referred to as Tejas and at times as Nuevas Filipinas or New Philippines, had smaller borders than Texas has today. Parts of South Texas were part of the Spanish provinces of Nuevo Santander, today Tamaulipas, Nueva Extremadura, today Coahuila, while most of West Texas was part of Nueva Vizcaya, today Chihuahua and Durango, or part of Nuevo Mexico. The Panhandle was claimed by France as part of Louisiana, but that became less of a problem when the French colony was given to Spain in 1763. Tejas was a frontier settlement long on the border of Spanish control and was sparsely populated by Spanish settlers. Other than San Antonio, Spain's other main towns included La Baya, today Goliad, and Nacogdoches, among the missions in the province's east. Besides that, Spanish settlers founded towns in other provinces that would later become Texan, like Laredo and Nuevo Santander, and in Nueva Vizcaya, two towns along the river, Presidio del Norte, today Presidio, and El Paso del Rio Grande del Norte. Founded on the south bank of the river, the section of the city that spread north of the river would keep its name after it became part of the United States. In reality, though, much of Tejas was under native, not Spanish, control. The Caddo Confederacy exercised great control over East Texas, while most of the high inland prairies were part of a Comanche empire called Numanu Sucobita, or to the Spanish, Comancheria. Master equestrians nicknamed Lords of the Plains, the Comanche dominated the South Plains and pushed out rival tribes like the Apache further into the southwest. They lived a nomadic lifestyle, living in teepees which were easy to transport quickly, hunting the bison that roamed the plains, and controlling trade in the region. Quick surprise raids devastated Spanish settlements and kept Spanish colonial control limited to the south and east of Texas. Indeed, Comancheria would long outlast Spain and even Mexico in its control of Texas. Meanwhile, this rural frontier province had a new land-hungry neighbor. The United States, born from Britain's revolutionary East Coast colonies, had purchased French Louisiana and now bordered Tejas to the north and east. Initially claiming parts of the Spanish province as its own, the Louisiana-Tejas border would be settled at the Sabine River, but it was just the beginning of more conflict to come. In the meantime, conflicts between European settlers and Native Americans in the east had pushed a number of new peoples into the region. Bands of Alabama, Coushatta, Seminole, Biloxi, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Lenape, Quapaw, and Cherokee people fled into the region from the east and resettled there. Spanish control of New Spain was weakening. Only about 5,000 Spaniards lived in Tejas, and much of the claimed borders were in reality controlled by the powerful Comanche. Meanwhile, revolutionaries throughout New Spain were waging a war of independence against Spanish rule. Their grasp on the continent seemed incredibly unstable, and Spain wanted a larger population in the province to keep the Comanche at bay. In 1820, an American businessman from Missouri named Moses Austin, struggling to make money, planned to establish a community of Americans in Spanish Tejas and start a trading venture between the U.S. and its new neighbor. He received approval from Spain but died in 1821. So did New Spain. That same year, the colony's revolutionaries won the War of Independence and signed a treaty with Spain declaring the foundation of a new country, Mexico, the third of the 6 flags of Texas. The deadliest battle in Texan history, the Battle of Medina, was one of a number of battles waged in Tejas as Mexico fought for independence. Mexico merged the sparsely populated Tejas with neighboring Coahuila to create the new state of Coahuila y Tejas. Moses Austin's son Stephen had vowed to make his father's dream of an American settlement in Tejas a reality, and Mexico, hoping to grow the state's population by encouraging foreign settlers to move in, passed the huge tract of land granted to Austin down to his son. Stephen Austin brought 297 families, mostly white Southerners of British descent from neighboring Louisiana and other states across the South, and the black Americans they'd enslaved. Known as the Old 300, they were about 1,790 people in total, suddenly a huge chunk of Tejas' population, which had stood somewhere around 3,500 before Mexican independence. There was now a large minority of white and black, English-speaking, culturally Southern Americans living in this Mexican state. Slavery was illegal in Mexico, and Austin secured special approval from the country to exempt it from Coahuila y Tejas. These families would settle in communities around the Brazos and Colorado rivers, founding towns like San Felipe de Austin, Washington on the Brazos, Columbia, Matagorda, Independence, and others. Other American businessmen would follow. Known as empresarios, they were given tracts of land with the promise that they would settle it. Dozens of empresarios staked out land grants in Coahuila y Tejas, and eventually Mexico opened up the province to any settler who would become a Mexican citizen. They sold plots of land for $30 and then exempted settlers from taxes for 10 years. The U.S. at the time was undergoing an economic crisis, and many Americans flocked across the border to take advantage of these cheap land deals. Settlers had to be Catholic, but there were hardly any Mexican authorities to enforce these rules with the throngs of new immigrants. In fact, many people would just cross and squat on the land without purchasing it at all. By 1830, Tejas, which had been home to a population of just 3,500 Mexicans known as Tejanos, now had 20,000 residents, mostly American immigrants who called themselves Texans. The region had quickly become a majority English-speaking, culturally American part of Mexico, where many residents had closer ties to the U.S. and practiced slavery. These American immigrants pronounced the name of their new home not as Tejas, but Texas. By 1835, its population had risen to 35,000. In 1826, an American empresario had staged a revolt in East Texas, trying to secede and found the so-called Republic of Fredonia, which was quickly quashed. It would not be the last, though. With Americans disobeying Mexican law, Mexico outright banned American immigration in 1830, but Americans continued to cross in illegally. Unrest riled Mexico, eventually leading to a general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna seizing power in a coup. Opposing the Mexican government, which had banned American immigration and opposed slavery, many Anglo-Texians at first supported Santa Anna. But Santa Anna, who would rule Mexico as a dictator, quickly came into conflict with the troublesome province. Texians generally viewed themselves as American and continued to act as if American law applied despite living in a foreign country, often openly opposing Mexican authority. Used to strong individual freedoms, they particularly came to oppose Santa Anna's hard-handed reign. Meanwhile, Mexico's government came to believe that they had given the Texians too many special privileges, exempting them from the ban on slavery and even from paying taxes, and that giving them their own laws might stir up unrest elsewhere in the country. They also worried that, more culturally connected to the United States than Mexico, they might stir up a revolution. In 1830, Mexico cracked down on the state, banning new American immigration, new slavery, implementing stronger tariffs restricting trade with the U.S., and encouraging more Mexicans to move to Coahuila y Tejas. Now Santa Anna was centralizing power in his hands. He overthrew the country's constitution and ordered the state legislatures of each Mexican state to dissolve. Coahuila y Tejas' governor, Agustin Viesca, wouldn't follow Santa Anna's orders and kept the legislature in session. He was arrested. Stephen Austin, lobbying Santa Anna to change his laws, was arrested as well, though eventually released. It wasn't long before the discontent turned into an all-out revolt. In other parts of the country, like the states of Zacatecas and Oaxaca, Mexicans took up arms against the Santa Anna regime. Cracking down on the rebellions, Santa Anna's troops slaughtered 2,000 unarmed civilians in Zacatecas. Texians began to talk about potential independence and decided to hold a convention to vote on whether the region's residents supported remaining under Santa Anna's centralized regime, going back to the federal system they had before where states had more individual power, or pushing for independence altogether, and Texians began to stockpile arms, supported by leaders like Stephen Austin. In October of 1835, Mexico, worried about an uprising in Coahuila y Tejas, demanded that the town of Gonzales return a cannon lent to protect it from Comanche raids. When they refused, raising a flag over it that said, "Come and take it," soldiers went to retrieve it, and a skirmish broke out, the soldiers eventually turning back. To Tejas' neighbors in the United States, it was eerily reminiscent of the Battle of Lexington, the brief skirmish over a weapons depot that had ultimately led to their own country's independence from Britain. Santa Anna sent thousands of troops into Coahuila y Tejas, and on March 2, 1836, the Texan Revolution already underway, Texian delegates met at Washington on the Brazos and declared the independence of the country they called Texas, naming a delegate named David Burnett the interim president. A Texian named Sam Houston, the former governor of Tennessee, was chosen to command the rebel forces, and Stephen Austin was given the important role of building an alliance with the United States, who would prove to be an essential ally. Things immediately looked bad for the rebels. They were far outnumbered, and Santa Anna began winning a string of victories. A bloody battle at the Alamo Mission in San Antonio left only a few survivors on the Texian side, and Santa Anna's troops slaughtered even the rebels who'd surrendered. It wasn't only the Anglo-Texians who participated in the Texas Revolution. Tejanos, the region's Mexican population who'd been there before American immigration began, largely supported the revolution as well, which was one of a number of movements fighting back against the Santa Anna regime across Mexico. Indeed, a few years after the Texas Revolution ended, independence movements would successfully take control in other parts of the country, declaring for a few years the Republic of the Yucatan, and just to the south, Coahuila, along with the states of Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, would merge into the short-lived Republic of the Rio Grande, its capital at the now Texan city of Laredo, an often forgotten seventh flag over Texas. Also killed at the Alamo were a number of American volunteers who'd crossed the border to support the revolutionaries. The frontiersman and Congressman Davy Crockett was one of them, and he too was killed at the Alamo, along with Texian frontiersman Jim Bowie. The bloody defeat at the Alamo took on a symbolic importance to the revolutionaries, spurring Texans and Tejanos alike to enlist, and across the border, Americans to support the movement. Remember the Alamo became a rallying cry for both the rebels and their supporters. Not long after, at Goliad, Santa Anna's troops defeated Texian forces, captured over 400 prisoners of war, and executed each of them in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. Texian and Tejano civilians across the breakaway state began fleeing their homes in fear of the oncoming Mexican forces, who marched all the way into East Texas. Encamped at the meeting point of Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River near Galveston Bay, Texian troops led by Sam Houston launched a devastating surprise attack. More than 600 Mexican troops were killed in the Battle of San Jacinto, compared to only 11 Texians. Santa Anna himself was captured not long after, and in exchange for safe release back to Veracruz, he signed the Treaties of Velasco, agreeing to pull Mexican troops back south of the Rio Grande, well beyond the previous border of Tejas, which had been the Nueces River further north, and recognized Texian independence. Signed as a prisoner of war, Mexico's Congress, however, refused to agree to the treaty and considered Texas to still be a rightful part of Mexico. With the withdrawal of troops, though, the Republic of Texas was functionally an independent country. A new nation had been born on the North American continent. They eventually settled on the iconic Lone Star flag to represent them, the fourth flag over Texas, and elected Sam Houston, the general who had led them to victory, as their first president. Stephen Austin, who'd become revered as the father of Texas, served as its first Secretary of State, but died 2 months into the Republic's independence. The capital, which had moved between cities like San Antonio, San Felipe de Austin, Washington on the Brazos, Harrisburg, and others, as the Republic's leadership had fled from site to site during the war, was moved to Columbia, and not long after, to a new city on Buffalo Bayou, founded to be the capital, named Houston in honor of the president. 2 years later, in 1839, it would be moved to a spot in the original Stephen Austin colony, a town named Waterloo on the Colorado River. Waterloo was renamed Austin in his honor, and would remain the capital ever since. Some Texian politicians, like second President Mirabeau Lamar, wanted Texas to remain independent, while others, like Sam Houston, who would be reelected again after Lamar, wanted it to join the United States. Nationalists like Lamar, who had strong support in the country's frontier west, sought to wage war against the Comanche and expand its borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean, while supporters of annexation opposed this expansionist policy. In 1837, the United States recognized the independence of the Republic of Texas, drawing it immediately into controversy with Mexico, who still claimed the country as their own. On top of that, the Republic, in practice, controlled the land between the Red, Sabine, and Nueces rivers, and even then, much of that territory was in the hands of the Comanche. However, Santa Anna's promise to withdraw south of the Rio Grande led them to claim land all the way to that river, including areas in the Rio Grande Valley that had long been considered part of the states of Tamaulipas, Coahuila, and Chihuahua, such as the cities of Laredo and El Paso, as well as land to the west and north that had been part of Mexico's sparsely populated frontier territories of Nuevo Mexico and Alta California, including the Nuevo Mexicano capital of Santa Fe, areas that were in reality controlled by the Comanche and other tribes, and stretches of Rocky Mountain wilderness where neither Mexico nor Texas exercised any real authority. Those vast claims include land that's today part of Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, and even as far north as Carbon County, Wyoming. These disputes were very real. The Comanche launched numerous raids from Comancheria into Texian towns, as did troops from Mexico, but for the most part, the Republic retained control of the land that had been part of Mexican Tejas. Annexation had been a conversation within both Texas and the United States since gaining independence. The country was struggling economically and was worried about defending itself from both Comancheria and Mexico, enemies to the west and south, and many Texians thought that they would be better off as part of their ally to the east, not to mention the cultural similarities the country shared, as most of Texas's population were either American immigrants or their descendants. The country's population had more than doubled in the decade following independence. By 1845, its population had risen from 52,000 upon independence to 125,000. On top of the Tejanos and native people who'd lived there before, more Americans continued to immigrate into Texas, and new towns were springing up left and right. Large populations moved into Spanish cities like San Antonio, and towns founded after independence like Galveston and Houston, the new city that was the largest in the country. A number of Texians opposed annexation, though, and hoped to remain independent. And in the United States, as controversy grew over slavery, abolitionists opposed adding this slave-holding country as a state, while others worried that it would provoke a war with Mexico. Some Americans, though, were itching for such a war, seeing an opportunity for the U.S. to seize Mexican territory and expand further westward in what they called manifest destiny. One of them, James Knox Polk, was elected president in 1844. In 1845, he pushed Congress to ratify an annexation treaty proposed by his predecessor, John Tyler. Both the Texian and American governments approved the treaty, and December 29, 1845, President Polk signed it into law, annexing the Republic of Texas and immediately admitting it to the Union as the 28th state. Thus rose the fifth flag over Texas, the American flag. The former country's residents under the U.S. would generally come to be known as Texans instead of Texians. As expected, the annexation immediately sparked conflict with Mexico, who cut off all diplomatic ties with the U.S. The U.S. claimed that their new border was the disputed Rio Grande, while Mexico, who had never recognized Texian independence, saw this as the U.S. claiming annexation of a rightful part of Mexico. When Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor south of the Nueces, Mexican troops responded, and the Mexican-American War began. After decisive victories in this disputed Nueces Strip, near where Brownsville is today, such as the Battle of Palo Alto, Taylor's troops crossed the Rio Grande and launched a full invasion of Mexico. In the 2-year Mexican-American War, American troops seized the country's frontier territories, occupied the disputed parts of Texas, and under General Winfield Scott even captured the heart of the country, Mexico City. It was a devastating loss for Mexico, who, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, had to cede more than half of its territory, not just their claims to Texas, now all the way to the Rio Grande, but their two large northern territories as well, Nuevo Mexico and Alta California. The Mexican cession would be, after the Louisiana and Alaska purchases, the third largest ever expansion of U.S. territory, and brought land that would make up some 7 states, half of the American West, into U.S. control. All of California, Nevada, and Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico are part of the U.S. because of events that began in Texas. In 1850, the federal government purchased much of Texas's western claims, providing them funds to pay off debts and relieve their struggling economy, and giving the state, still now the largest in the country by far, the borders it has today. 212,000 people lived in the new state, more than a number of already existing states, and just 10 years later it had nearly tripled to 604,000. A number of German and Czech immigrants moved in, primarily to central Texas and the Hill Country, but those moving into the state were mostly Southerners, primarily white Americans of English, Irish, and Scots-Irish descent who settled in East Texas, continuing the spread of plantation agriculture into the new state and turning East Texas into cotton country, part of a larger belt of slavery that extended all the way to the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia. By 1860, the eve of the Civil War, 182,000 Texans, nearly a third of the state's population, lived in chains. Texas had had a tumultuous few decades. A Spanish Tejano born in 1821 would have been born a citizen of Spain, lived to become a Mexican, Texian, and then American citizen, living under 4 flags and experiencing 3 wars in their lifetime. Before their 40th birthday, they would witness the start of a 4th major war and become part of a 5th country, which brings us to the 6th flag over Texas, that of the Confederacy. Divisions over slavery had been brewing in the U.S. for decades, and as new states were added, whether or not those states would legalize or ban the horrible practice could determine the balance of power in the U.S. Senate and the future of slavery in the long run. The annexation of the Lone Star State and the Mexican cession that followed made the question of where slavery would be extended to all the more real. The election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed the spread of slavery to new states, infuriated many Southerners, and following his election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed by a number of other Southern states. On February 1st, 1861, Texas became the 7th state to secede, and the last to do so before the Battle of Fort Sumter started an all-out war. It's also the last Confederate state I'll cover in this series. Though it was a very new state, slavery had been practiced in Texas since American immigrants had started moving there when it was part of Mexico. Most Texans were descendants of American Southerners, and considered Texas to be part of the South. At the same time, Texas had always existed on the frontier of Spain, Mexico, the United States, and now the Confederacy. Though it maintained strong cultural connections to the South, Texans were descendants of people who had left their homes to settle in the sparsely populated edge of a foreign country, as well as people who had lived in that country for generations. The Cotton Belt ended in Texas, and beyond it, part of the same state, were the high plains and deserts controlled by Comancheria, a powerful Native American empire. It was the Wild West, and this frontier spirit, which had driven their ancestors to leave their homes and later to rebel from Mexico, was a powerful part of the state's independent identity. Texas was not just Southern, it was the beginning of something new, the American West. Much of the state supported secession, though areas like the Hill Country, settled by German immigrants, and places to the south, home to large Czech communities, opposed it. So did the state's first governor, former President Sam Houston, whose election makes him the only American to serve as the governor of two different states. Refusing to support the Confederacy, Houston was forced out of office. Though many Texans fought for the Confederacy, there were no major battles in the state. It served as a supply point for the rebel country through trade across the Mexican border, but after Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg and with it took the Mississippi River, Texas was cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. The Union won in April 1865, but so far from the rest of the country, it took until June 19th, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, for news of emancipation to reach the state. On that first Juneteenth, word of emancipation reached the country's last enslaved people. Less reliant on slavery than the rest of the Confederacy, post-war Texas grew rapidly as Americans continued to flock west to settle in this southwestern frontier state. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, the military waged war against the Comanche, taking control of Comancheria and pushing its residents into a reservation in Indian Territory to the north. Cattle ranching became an important industry in the plains of the north and west. Following the long tradition of Mexican vaqueros, young men called cowboys would round up herds of cattle in the plains and run them north on routes like the Chisholm Trail in long cattle drives to rail towns in Kansas and other states, before they'd be shipped off to stockyards in Chicago. This influx of men into towns along the route during cattle drives led cow towns like Fort Worth to develop, becoming bustling centers of business. The hardscrabble life of cowboys and the people of the western frontier, where settlers fought Native Americans, bandits and stagecoach robbers could evade capture, and sheriffs and frontier lawmen fought to keep the peace in remote, dusty, lawless prairie and mountain outposts, captivated Americans, and the idea of the Wild West became a cornerstone of America's national identity, as much a myth as a reality. In Texas especially, it became a key element of the state's conception of itself, embodied by the Texas Rangers, formed by Stephen Austin to protect American settlers in Texas, who went on to fight the Comanche and today remain the state's investigative unit. Cowboy and Wild West imagery can be found across the Lone Star State, and indeed much of the state remains remote ranchland, desert, and prairie to this day. At the same time, railroads spurred industry and growth in cities like Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston, as people moved in from across the country. Places like Dallas, not on any major waterway, grew to its strategic location on western rail lines, as opposed to American cities further east, which typically developed on major rivers. The state's largest city, though, was the bustling port of Galveston, a center of business and commerce, sitting on a barrier island guarding the mouth of Galveston Bay, home to 40,000 people. In September of 1900, disaster struck. A hurricane hit Galveston, flooding and all but destroying the city. Every building in the city was at least damaged, if not completely destroyed. 10,000 people became homeless. Anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 were killed. Either way, it's the deadliest natural disaster ever in American history. Half of the population of Texas's largest city had been killed or lost their home. Thousands fled, and though the city would eventually rebuild, it would lose out as growth moved to other Texan cities instead. Texas had grown rapidly each decade, to 1.6 million in 1880, 2.2 million in 1890, and 3 million in 1900. At the turn of the century, it was the sixth most populous state in the country, surpassing all but the eastern and midwestern industrial giants of New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri.
but the previous growth would pale in comparison to what would come next. In 1894, prospectors digging a well for water in the town of Corsicana came upon an interesting discovery: oil. Most of the country's oil came out of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and had helped transform those states into the industrial powers that they were. The find in Corsicana led to more exploration, and in 1901 they struck it big. At a site called Spindletop near the town of Beaumont, an oil gusher began to spew for 9 days straight. Texas, it turns out, was home to a lot of oil, and hopeful oilmen flocked to the state, founding oil companies and hoping to strike it big. Out west in Permian Basin towns like Midland and Odessa, an oil drilling economy took root. In the 1910s, many Mexican refugees, including a large number of business leaders and political dissidents fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution, resettled in El Paso, and the border town began to become a major city. Throughout the 1920s, farmers began to cultivate drier lands with poorer soil in West Texas and the Panhandle, a phenomenon that was occurring across the Great Plains. Many speculators promoting the land outright lied that new farming techniques would make this drought-prone region fertile. In the midst of the Great Depression, though, a series of droughts and dust storms ripped up the soil, destroying the livelihoods of farmers, their families, and entire rural towns, and making many people deeply sick. The Dust Bowl, which came at a time when much of America was already mired in poverty, caused a massive migration out of the plains. 2.5 million people left the Great Plains, including from the Texas Panhandle. Many headed west to California, where they took up migrant farm work in the Salinas Valley, Central Valley, and other agricultural parts of the state. At the same time, black Texans worked in low-paying, exploitative sharecropping jobs and suffered under the segregated racial regime of Jim Crow. Hundreds of black Texans were murdered in lynchings following the end of slavery. The state was third in total number of lynchings, surpassed by only Mississippi and Georgia. With jobs opening up in the world wars in northern cities, many black Texans left for industrial jobs to the north like St. Louis and Kansas City. In a second wave, many left for the West Coast, particularly Los Angeles and Oakland. In 1947, a fire broke out on board a ship carrying a huge quantity of ammonium nitrate docked in Texas City in Galveston Bay. It caused a series of massive explosions, among the largest non-nuclear explosions ever, that destroyed the port and leveled much of the city, killing 581 people in the largest industrial accident ever in American history, leaving 2,000 homeless. The wartime and post-war economy brought enormous growth to the state. Oil exploration and refining continued to boom. Processing plants, military bases, and with the Cold War, the space industry moved in. In 1961, the Johnson Space Center, NASA's Flight Control Center, opened in Houston and immortalized the phrase, "Houston, we have a problem." By 1960, Texas reached a population of 9.5 million, sixth in the nation. With the Texas oil boom, America had become more dependent on petroleum than ever before, and there was money in this massive industry. Houston and Dallas became major financial centers. By 1970, the sixth and eighth largest cities in the country, respectively. On November 22, 1963, the eyes of the world turned to Dallas. President John F. Kennedy, campaigning for re-election in the state, was driving through the city's Dealey Plaza with his wife Jackie and Texas's Governor John Connally when shots rang out. Kennedy was killed and Connally injured. The suspected assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, believed to have fired from a window in the nearby Texas School Book Depository, was himself assassinated before he could stand trial, leaving Kennedy's assassination shrouded in mystery. His vice president, Texan Lyndon B. Johnson, was sworn in on Air Force One on the tarmac of Dallas's Love Field. In 1993, an armed cult outside of Waco called the Branch Davidians engaged in a month-long standoff with state and federal law enforcement, eventually ending in a fire which engulfed the compound. All in all, 86 people were killed in the Waco siege. Texas continued to grow rapidly in the end of the 20th century. In the decades after World War II, Americans with more financial freedom as well as actual mobility with the rise of the automobile left colder northern Rust Belt states that were struggling economically as the U.S. transitioned from a manufacturing to services economy to warmer Sun Belt states like Texas, which with the advent of air conditioning were much more pleasant places to live than they had ever been. Cities like Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Fort Worth, and Austin
began to grow as sprawling suburban developments built for the automobile housed transplants flocking to the state. Dallas and Fort Worth grew so large that their suburbs fused into a single urban area. New residents were attracted in part by the high-paying jobs in finance, high-tech, and oil, and became a major destination for immigrants as well. Mexican immigrants flocked to agricultural jobs in the Rio Grande Valley, and to cities like Houston, El Paso, and San Antonio, while Asian immigrants from countries like India, Vietnam, and China moved to suburban Dallas, Houston, and Austin. In 1980, Texas became the third most populous state in the country, after California and New York. By 2000, it was second, and became the second state ever to surpass 20 million residents. Today, it's reached 30 million. In the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been a major destination for people moving internally in the U.S., particularly as high housing prices have caused California to start to lose residents, and new businesses have moved in to take advantage of its low taxes. In 2023, it grew by about 1.5%, the third highest growth rate in the country and something that matches longer-term trends. In fact, since 2008, the Texan population has increased by about 1.5% on average every year, the third highest rate after Utah and Idaho. Austin has been an American boomtown, increasing its metro population by a quarter in the last decade alone, and new skyscrapers are rising left and right as people flock to the city. Most growth has been in the suburbs and rural areas surrounding Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, while rural parts of the state further west and south have lost residents. In the early 2020s, a major surge of immigration across the state's southern border with Mexico has once again put Texas in the national spotlight. Texas is home to 5 major urban areas, among the most of any state in the country, and together they help give the state such a large population. Its largest urban area, Houston, is an enormous American city, one of the largest in the country. 5.85 million people live in the sprawling metropolis on the Gulf. Its urban area surpassed in the U.S. by only New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami. The city limits itself, not including large suburbs like Pasadena, Sugar Land, Pearland, and Conroe, is huge as well, the country's 4th largest by that metric. It's the largest city in the country with a population that's growing, and it has the 4th largest skyline in the U.S., with more skyscrapers than even the larger city of Los Angeles, or internationally, London. Areas like Tanglewood and the Texas Medical Center, the largest medical complex on the planet, a mini city of hospitals and research facilities, contain high-density clusters of skyscrapers and high-rises on their own. Downtown Houston sits on Buffalo Bayou, a slow tidal river that drains into Galveston Bay on the edge of the city. A city of business, it's been at the center of the economic growth that came with the rise of the oil and aerospace industries and other high-tech jobs in the state. Its strategic location on the Gulf of Mexico's Galveston Bay turned it into America's premier oil port, refining the oil and gas that's extracted further inland in the state and shipping it across the country and the world through the busiest port in the United States. NASA's Mission Control is located at the massive Johnson Space Center complex near Galveston Bay. Downtown is a center of business and finance, gleaming glass and steel skyscrapers housing the headquarters of enormous companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Halliburton. After just New York City and Chicago, Houston is home to the 3rd largest number of Fortune 500 companies in the country. Its J.P. Morgan Chase Tower, rising over 1,000 feet, is the tallest building in Texas and places Texas 6th when ranking states by their tallest building, after New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, and Georgia. The 567-foot-tall San Jacinto Monument, memorializing the site where Texas won its independence from Mexico, is the tallest column on the planet, surpassing even the Washington Monument. Home to large Black, White, Latino, and Asian American populations, it's one of the most diverse cities in the United States, a major destination for immigrants from Mexico, Vietnam, China, India, and Pakistan, home to the country's highest proportion of Asian Americans outside the west or east coasts, and the country's largest black population west of the Mississippi. Founded not long after Texan independence, older neighborhoods like the old 6th Ward and the wealthy River Oaks sit closer to downtown, while other suburban developments that came with later growth sprawl out for miles and miles, even reaching the historic coastal city of Galveston, today a popular tourist destination for Texas beachgoers. The East Texas city is the most culturally southern major city in the state and a modern, booming center of business and finance. Only slightly smaller than Houston, the Dallas-Fort Worth area is the sixth largest urban area in the country, with 5.73 million people living between the two core cities and their sprawling, overlapping suburbs like Arlington, Irving, and Plano. Dallas and Fort Worth, whose suburbs have fused together into one massive urban area, sit about 30 miles apart, roughly a 35-minute drive between the downtowns, both on the Trinity River. Dallas is the larger of the two, the region's main urban core. It's a mix of older yellow brick towers and newer gleaming skyscrapers like the lollipop-shaped Reunion Tower, which offers sweeping views of the city. Like Houston, it's one of America's largest cities, a massive, sprawling metropolis. A center of business, it grew as railway lines stretched into the cotton, cattle, and oil country of Texas, shipping these goods and products across the country, and developed further as highways followed. It's just behind Houston as the American city with the country's fourth most Fortune 500 companies, and is home to one of the country's 12 Federal Reserve banks. Dealey Plaza, the site of John F. Kennedy's assassination, remains a memorial to the country's 35th president, and the Texas School Book Depository has been converted into an excellent museum on the assassination that is absolutely worth a visit. The city also has a giant eyeball, which is kind of fun. Fort Worth, though sitting very much within the orbit of Dallas and with a much smaller downtown than its eastern counterpart, is still a major city in its own right. It feels in a sense like the most quintessentially Texan of the state's major cities. It has a nice downtown with red brick streets and sidewalks centered around Sundance Square, a great public plaza in the heart of town. On the other side of the city, the Fort Worth stockyards have been transformed into a popular entertainment district, its Western-themed shops and saloons paying tribute to the city's long history as one of Texas's most important cow towns. Far smaller than the massive Houston and Dallas, but still a large American city, San Antonio, with its 1.99 million residents, is the 24th largest urban area in the country and third in the state. It's one of my favorite cities in the U.S. and easily the most historic city in Texas, founded by Spanish colonists in the early 1700s and serving as its colonial capital. Through Spanish and Mexican rule until the influx of American settlers, it remained far and away the largest and most important city in Texas. Its Hispanic heritage runs deep, and this South Texas city, at the foot of the beautiful hill country, remains the largest majority Latino city in the United States. It's filled with historic areas right downtown, like La Villita, a neighborhood dating back to Spanish rule that's today an arts district, the San Fernando Cathedral, and the Alamo, the Spanish mission that became so symbolic in the Texas Revolution and Mexican-American War. The city has 5 Spanish missions, which together have been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only one in the state. Downtown is beautiful, filled with older yellow brick and stone skyscrapers dating to the early 1900s. The Tower of the Americas is the second tallest observation tower in the U.S. after only Las Vegas's Stratosphere, surpassing a number of other tall Texas observation towers like the San Jacinto Monument and Reunion Tower. The city's Riverwalk, which follows the San Antonio River as it winds through downtown, is a pathway-lined urban park and shopping center that adds a second layer to the city. The beautiful Riverwalk has been a success story for the city, helping turn San Antonio into the most visited city in the state by domestic tourists, and the 8th most visited in the country, as well as inspiring countless similar projects across the United States and the world. Overall, Texas is a huge tourist destination, taking in more visitors than all but California, Florida, and Nevada. 122 million people overall. The big story in recent years, though, has been the rapid rise of Austin, the fastest growing city in America. Its 1.8 million residents making it the 29th largest urban area in the country and the 4th in Texas, just behind San Antonio and catching up quickly. Visit Austin and it's impossible to miss. It feels like a small capital or college town that became a huge city overnight. Cranes are up everywhere with gleaming skyscrapers going up left and right along the Colorado River. Bars and restaurants sit right among residential areas, sometimes just in former houses, and quiet residential neighborhoods sit alongside new skyscrapers. It's a city in the throes of an ongoing transformation from a small to a quite large metropolis. Not far from San Antonio at the foot of the hill country, it's part of a string of cities at the edge of the higher plains and prairies that stretches within the state from San Antonio to Dallas. Beautiful green parks line the Colorado River, and a system of well-used trails and boardwalks all along the city's rivers and creeks offer views of its beautiful, rapidly expanding downtown and make it incredibly accessible to pedestrians. Barton Springs is an outdoor spring that's a popular place to swim, as is Hamilton Pool just outside the city in the hill country. A huge colony of bats lives underneath the Congress Avenue Bridge, and their nightly flights draw massive crowds. It's known for its great food truck scene, as well as for live music. Nicknamed the live music capital of the world, the city's music scene has been a huge draw, turning it into a national center of media and entertainment, home to huge music festivals like Austin City Limits and South by Southwest, a part music and film festival and part tech conference and exposition. The city's a major tech hub as well, Silicon Valley companies like Tesla and Oracle relocating to the city in recent years as the Bay Area has grown more expensive, joining existing Austin corporations like Dell. The capital city of Texas, it's home to a beautiful state capitol building, a reddish-pink granite state house that, because everything is bigger in Texas, is larger than every other state capital and even the U.S. Capitol in D.C. in square footage, though it's not the country's tallest. Though the seat of government of one of the country's most prominent conservative-leaning states, the city itself is pretty liberal, due not only to the new people who have moved there in recent years, but due as well to the University of Texas at Austin, the flagship campus of UT, and the 9th largest university in the country. It's a city that's popular with young people and as such has a lively nightlife scene. Finally, we have El Paso, whose 854,000 residents make it the 5th largest urban area in the state and the 53rd in the country. Over 500 miles from Austin, Dallas, or San Antonio, this city in the Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas has more in common culturally with neighboring New Mexico and perhaps even neighboring border regions of Mexico than Texas's other far-off population centers. Nestled between the Franklin Mountains and the Rio Grande, it's, after San Antonio, the country's second largest majority Latino city, and has the largest proportion of Latino residents of any major American city at 81%. Across the river, Ciudad Juarez, its Mexican counterpart, is larger but far poorer than El Paso, and though the border crossings between the cities are a major site of international trade, the economic disparities between the two are impossible to miss, and it's easy to think, looking at El Paso's skyline, that it's the larger of the two. While Juarez is one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico, El Paso consistently ranks among the safest in the U.S. The oil industry, railroads, and military presence with the city's Fort Bliss have helped the city at the very western edge of Texas grow into a major regional center. In terms of race, Texas is among the most diverse states in the country, with large proportions of several of the country's largest racial groups. Roughly 40% of Texans are white, which makes it one of just 7 so-called majority-minority states in the country. Another 40% are Latino, mostly Mexican American, 12% are Black, 5% are Asian American, and 3% are multiracial. Most Texans trace their ancestry to Mexico, both from under Spanish and Mexican rule, as well as to later immigrants from within the country's current borders, as well as to enslaved Black people from Africa, and to immigrants, settlers, and colonists from Germany, Ireland, and England. Because Texas has such a large population overall, it's home in sheer numbers to the second largest Latino population, largest Black population, third largest Asian population, and despite being a majority-minority state, the second largest white population in the United States. With a large number of immigrants from Asia, as well as a Mexican population with deep roots in the state, 36% of Texans speak a language other than English at home, the second highest proportion after only California. 27% of Texans speak Spanish, making it the most Spanish-speaking state in the country. In terms of religion, most Texans, 77%, are Christian, predominantly Protestant, of them mostly evangelical, although the state has a large Catholic population as well, with Catholicism dominating in the majority Hispanic Rio Grande Valley and South Texas. Texas has some of the best food you'll find in the U.S., with great Mexican-influenced southwestern cuisine, southern styles of food like barbecue, and styles that fuse the two, such as Tex-Mex. This regional style of cooking originated with the Tejanos, who, living on the Mexican frontier, had a different culinary tradition than Mexicans in other parts of the country. Elements like the heavy use of cumin and cheese came from the Canary Islands, where many Spanish immigrants to Texas came from. It's a fusion cuisine influenced by both countries. Southern barbecued meats are often used, as well as American-made cheeses. Nachos were invented just across the border in Piedras Negras, and along with fajitas, queso, and margaritas, are a staple of Tex-Mex cooking, which has become popular across the United States. Texans also love chili, which they make without beans. Czech kolaches are popular, and chicken fried steak, which has become synonymous with Texas, was actually brought by Germans and is based off of Wiener Schnitzel. Like in much of the South, pecan pie is popular, as is barbecue, and the state has a number of regional styles. In East Texas, barbecue is much more like the rest of the South. In South Texas, it's influenced by Mexican cooking, and in the West, it's much more of a Southwestern style. The key element is brisket, which was also brought by Germans and Czechs. I can't leave out Whataburger, a Texas chain which has a devoted following in the state, and then there's the supermarket chain H-E-B, which is known for having ridiculously huge stores. Texans have a distinctive accent. It's generally rooted in the southern accents that the state's English-speaking settlers spoke, and is a mix of both Deep South and Appalachian South accents, along with influences from Midwestern settlers, Mexican Spanish speakers, and German and Czech immigrants. The greeting howdy is maybe the most famous element of the Texan dialect. Much of Texas, too, is Spanish-speaking. El Paso is the largest majority Spanish-speaking city in the U.S., and in much of South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, Spanish is more commonly spoken than English. The lower RGV town of Rio Grande City is the most Spanish-speaking place in the U.S. 96% of the town's population speaks only Spanish, and less than 4% only English. The state has had an extremely influential role in American music. Southerners brought blues, folk, and country music to the state, and it's left its imprint on country in particular, adding to the genre a distinctly southwestern element influenced by the musical traditions of Tejanos and Mexicans, and introducing it to the Mountain West, helping it grow into new styles like western swing and country western music. Wild West cowboy ballads, sung by Texas cowboys driving herds across the plains, became an influential part of the country western genre, including iconic Texan anthems like Deep in the Heart of Texas. Houston has had a major impact on rap music, and a number of major rappers have come out of the city, and Austin, known as the live music capital of the world, is one of America's best music cities, home to tons of music clubs, concerts, and festivals like Austin City Limits. Texas has 11 major league sports teams, fewer than California, and tied for second with Florida. Dallas-Fort Worth is one of just 12 major U.S. metro areas that has a team in each of the 5 major league sports leagues. The NFL's Dallas Cowboys play at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, a large suburb midway between Dallas and Fort Worth, and the MLB's Texas Rangers at Globe Life Field right next door. The NBA's Dallas Mavericks play at American Airlines Center in downtown Dallas, as do the NHL's Dallas Stars. The MLS's FC Dallas play at Toyota Stadium in the suburb of Frisco. Houston has 4 major league teams. The NFL's Houston Texans play at the NRG Stadium next to the famous but now abandoned Astrodome. The MLB's Houston Astros play at Dakin Park downtown. The NBA's Houston Rockets play downtown as well at the Toyota Center. And the MLS's Houston Dynamo play in downtown's Shell Energy Center. San Antonio and Austin have 1 team each, the NBA's San Antonio Spurs at the Frostbank Center, and the MLS's Austin FC at the Q2 Stadium. College sports, especially football, is popular in the state. Most Texans support UT Austin's Texas Longhorns and their famed symbol Hook'em Horns, though the areas surrounding UT El Paso, Baylor, Texas Tech, Texas Christian University, and their rival Texas A&M tend to support their respective teams. The first ever rodeo was held in the West Texas town of Pecos, and today this quintessential symbol of the American West, based off of cattle roundups in Spanish America, is Texas's official state sport. The largest rodeo in the world, which draws well over 2 million visitors a year, is the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. The largest newspapers in the state are the country's 9th most circulated paper, the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, the San Antonio Express News, the Fort Worth Star Telegram, and the Austin American Statesman.
The busiest airports in the state are the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, or DFW, George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Austin Bergstrom International Airport, Dallas Love Field, William P. Hobby Airport in Houston, and the San Antonio International Airport. DFW, as the main hub and the headquarters of American Airlines, is the largest airline in the world by passengers served, is the third busiest airport in the United States after just Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta and LAX in Los Angeles, and it typically ranks among the busiest airports on the planet. The country's third largest airline, Southwest, is also headquartered in Dallas, though at its other main airport, Love Field. Texas is home to the largest university in the United States, College Station's Texas A&M, whose Kyle Field is also one of the largest stadiums in the country, as well as the country's ninth largest university, the University of Texas at Austin. They currently have 77,000 and 53,000 students, respectively. Other major colleges include the University of Houston, the University of North Texas, the UT campuses in Arlington, Dallas, San Antonio, the Rio Grande Valley, and El Paso, Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas State in San Marcos, Sam Houston State in Harrisburg, Baylor, Lamar, Rice University, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, to name a few. Tons of major companies are headquartered in Texas, including ExxonMobil, AT&T, Frito-Lay, Phillips 66, Valero, Dell, 7-Eleven, Airbus, JCPenney, Dr. Pepper Snapple, American Airlines, Bell Helicopters, BNSF Railway, McKesson, Tesla, Southwest Airlines, Energy Transfer, Whole Foods, Cisco, Gold's Gym, Caterpillar, ConocoPhillips, Greyhound, Peterbilt, Oracle, Enterprise Products, Chuck E. Cheese, Texas Instruments, Chili's, Plains All-American Pipeline, Cinemark, Dave & Buster's, H-E-B, Dickies, GameStop, Halliburton, iHeartMedia, Jiffy Lube, Keurig Dr. Pepper, Marathon Oil, La Quinta, Neiman Marcus, NRG, Pizza Hut, Radio Shack, Six Flags, USAA, and of course, Whataburger. Famous Texans include Matthew McConaughey, Jamie Foxx, Kenny Rogers, Usher, Carol Burnett, Lance Armstrong, Steve Martin, Dan Rather, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Jalen Hurts, Sandra Day O'Connor, Chris Christopherson, Chip and Joanna Gaines, Buddy Holly, Post Malone, Farrah Fawcett, Simone Biles, Rick Riordan, Bonnie and Clyde, Adrian Peterson, Mark Cuban, Patrick Swayze, Erykah Badu, Howard Hughes, Jimmy Butler, Janis Joplin, Ava Longoria, Patrick Mahomes, Willie Nelson, Shaquille O'Neal, Beyonce, Jennifer Garner, Dennis Rodman, George Strait, Jennifer Love Hewitt, Dennis Quaid, Tommy Lee Jones, Scott Joplin, Selena, Walter Cronkite, Woody Harrelson, Owen Wilson, George Foreman, Selena Gomez, and Drew Brees. 4 Texans have been elected President of the United States, among the most of any state and the most of any state west of the Mississippi, and all since the end of World War II. In fact, we have only a few states left in the series that have produced a president. Though he was raised in and considered himself to be from Kansas, Dwight Eisenhower was born in the North Texas town of Denison on the Oklahoma border. He only lived there until he was 2, but would later be stationed in San Antonio for part of his distinguished military career. He would famously command the Allied troops in Europe during World War II, and afterwards serve as military governor of the U.S.-occupied Germany, the Army Chief of Staff, and NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe before he was elected president in 1952. Less than 3 years after Eisenhower left office, another Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson, would assume the presidency on Air Force One at Dallas's Love Field after his predecessor, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated as his motorcade drove through the city's Dealey Plaza. Born in a farmhouse in the Hill Country, LBJ served in the House of Representatives to a seat representing Austin in the Hill Country, and in 1948 was elected to the Senate. The so-called Master of the Senate, Johnson would become Majority Whip and then Majority Leader, and would become arguably the most influential legislator of that era, and many consider him to be one of the country's most effective senators ever. In 1960, he ran for president but lost the Democratic nomination to Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy, who chose him as his running mate. He would serve as vice president until Kennedy's assassination and would win election to a full term in a landslide, passing historic legislation like the Civil Rights Act.
By 1968, though, he'd become so unpopular due to the Vietnam War that he would withdraw from the primaries. While in office, he would often spend time at his ranch, near where he was born outside the hill country town of Stonewall. The property, which would take on the nickname of the Texas White House, is where he and his wife Lady Bird are buried. His presidential library is located in Austin on the campus of the University of Texas. The scion of a wealthy New England political and business family, George H.W. Bush, born in Massachusetts and raised in Connecticut, made his way west with the Texas oil boom, living in West Texas and eventually Houston, and founding the successful Zapata Petroleum Company. Bush began his political career as the chair of the Harris County Republican Party, going on to win a seat in the House representing Houston. From there, he would have a career spanning government and foreign policy, serving as UN ambassador, Republican National Committee chairman, and director of the CIA. He was still fairly unknown, however, when he ran for president in 1980, but his surprising second-place finish made him Ronald Reagan's choice for a running mate. He would serve 2 terms as vice president before he was elected president in 1988. His best friend, Houston's James Baker, would serve as chief of staff, secretary of the Treasury, and secretary of state, and was one of Washington's most influential appointed officials. His presidential library is located in College Station on the campus of Texas A&M University, where he and his wife Barbara are buried. Bush's son, George W. Bush, was born in Connecticut but lived nearly his entire life in Texas, growing up in Midland and Houston. He would, like his father, stake out a career in the oil industry before purchasing the Texas Rangers. In 1994, he was elected governor of Texas and in 2000 won the first of his 2 terms as president in an incredibly close election. After 9/11, he would bring the U.S. into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Today, he splits his time between Dallas and his Prairie Chapel Ranch near Crawford, which was a Western White House during his presidency. His presidential library is located in Dallas on the campus of Southern Methodist University. Texas is not just a red state, it is the red state. With such a large population, it typically provides the largest share of electoral votes for the Republican nominee for president. It isn't a deeply red state. Its Cook Partisan Voting Index is R+5, meaning that in a given election, it typically swings about 5% more towards the Republican candidate than the country on average. Though some recent Senate races have been close, it has been just out of reach for Democrats, and though somewhat competitive, it tends to be a reliable vote for Republicans, not having picked a Democrat for president since Jimmy Carter. It has 40 electoral votes and 38 members of the House of Representatives, second to only California. Of them, 25 are Republicans and 13 are Democrats. Its 2 senators, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, the runner-up in the 2016 Republican presidential primary, are Republicans, as is its governor, Greg Abbott. That is it for Texas. Up next, we've got the great state of Iowa. If you're from Iowa, please respond to my community post or my comment here to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as a quarterly channel newsletter, thumbnail previews, early access to maps I create, and shoutouts to my videos such as these. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I'll use in all the US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Texas who helped give me information for this video. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. I really enjoyed visiting Texas as part of my 6-month-long filmmaking trip across the country. From here on out, every single video in the US Explained will feature on-site clips and footage I filmed in that state. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, "That is interesting."